Walk through the streets of Liverpool and you are surrounded by reminders of the city's past, of the people who filled these streets in the generations before us. Famous names from history to dock workers and shop girls, legends of popular culture to everyday heroes. Liverpool Lives takes a look into their stories.
Today I'm on Stanley Street, by the statue of a very well-known lady. This is the statue of Eleanor Rigby, designed by Tommy Steele.
Lives in a dream, all the lonely people. Where do they all belong? Window, in the door, by the door. Who is it for?
Look at all the lonely people. Where do they all come from?
All the lonely people. Where do they all come from?
Oh, na 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 na. Where do they all belong?
Did something about the door, what the words of Eleanor Rigby, I don't know. I mean, I used to know, I can't remember, I've not heard it for a long time.
We know Eleanor Rigby as a lonely spinster in the Beatles hit. In the song, she dies alone, having waited at the window, living in a dream. However, there is a mystery to the song. Who was she waiting for?
The name Eleanor Rigby has been the source of fascination for Beatles fans since the song was released on the B-side of Yellow Submarine in 1966. For many, Eleanor Rigby is quite simply the woman depicted in the lyrics of McCartney and Lennon's song. However, could she have been more than a figment of Paul McCartney's imagination? A few months ago, I was contacted by a man in Dallas who had found an interesting book at an auction. The prayer book in question appears to date back to the early 20th century. However, what was really intriguing to Tony Williams, the man who bought the book, was that it was signed by one E. Rigby.
I have a book here I bought back in 2009. I went to visit my pastor out at his antique store out in Tomball, Texas. He wasn't there, and I just started looking around the shelves, pulling books down, just looking at how old they were. This was one of the books I happened to pull down. It says Sermons for Saint Days and Holy Days. I paid $8 for this book. I didn't buy it that day, but when I opened the book, I saw on the inside it had a signature, and that's the signature there, E. Rigby. And I went, that kind of sounds familiar. And I put the book back. And later on, I got around the internet and I thought, well, let me see, that must be a famous author or something. So I checked the name I typed in E. Rigby, and of course Eleanor Rigby came up.
This got me thinking, if Eleanor Rigby was a real person, who was she? And was the Eleanor Rigby of the myths and legends surrounding the Beatles the same Eleanor Rigby whose prayer book had found its way across the pond?
Well, who knows, really? You know, it's not about historical accuracy, is it? It's about somebody writing a piece of creative art. So whether that's inspired by something specific or something that's part of the writer's own imagination is the real point in question. I think the most likely is that there were probably several hundred Eleanor Rigbys by the 1960s. You know, Eleanor's an old English name, isn't it? And it would signify lots of different things to different people. But of course, there is a gravestone in St Peter St Paul's Church up in Woolton Village with that headstone. So that's quite an interesting thing, really. The inspiration for the song may or may not have come from that headstone directly, of course. McCartney says he can't kind of remember seeing it, really. But that's interesting. I mean, that's interesting in its own right. It may well be somewhere in the back of his mind that the name Eleanor Rigby came about. I could just imagine him walking away from maybe seeing it and thinking, that's quite interesting. Eleanor did remind you very much of a previous era. Maybe an Edwardian or Victorian era. It has that kind of connotation to it. So it's a good name to do something with as well. There's something quite symbolic about it in that respect. Well, it's in the appropriate place. and is very appropriate for the Beatles narrative, really. So, the story would be that Paul McCartney sought the grave, and it was in St Peter's Church, in the churchyard, obviously, and of course that's where John and Paul first met, in that area in particular. Woolton is a very interesting, leafy part of Liverpool, very Victorian and Edwardian in construction as well. Even, it's very sandstony, so it's kind of rather interesting from a narrative point of view. So the story goes that that name is stuck in his head, and he wrote the opening lines about it based on that. But of course, as we've said, McCartney kind of doesn't really remember it. So that adds to the mythos of the story by suggesting, well, maybe he saw it, when they first met each other as quarryman, and he joined the band, so to speak. So that adds another dimension to it then.
The Eleanor Rigby that is here died the year before John Lennon was born, and Paul McCartney has always said that the name Eleanor Rigby came from Eleanor Brom, who was in the film Help with the Beatles, and also Rigby's. It was either a baker's or a wine merchant in Bristol. Now, this churchyard here at St Peter's in Woolton is a place that him and John would regularly walk about. Eleanor Brom was an actress who came to prominence in a programme called That Was the Week That Was, and she was a satirical actress, and that's why they picked her for Help, because she was known to the Beatles. They liked the Beatles, or she liked them, they liked her, and that's why they wanted to work with her, because she was what they regarded as a fun character to work with. And that was basically it. So maybe subconsciously Paul had remembered the name Eleanor Rigby. And there are actually over 15 Eleanor Rigbys buried in churchyards in Liverpool. But this Eleanor Rigby, she lived locally, the family lived locally, and she did come to very great prominence a couple of years ago when Paul McCartney offered to sell, or gave to say for sale, a book that she had signed E. Rigby, and she was a scullery maid, a 14-year-old scullery maid in a local hospital, and that is where the association. The prayer book I'm a little more sceptical about, because prayer books were one of the things that was given to people, particularly in the 19th century, in the early 20th century, they were given prayer books. But whether or not it was hers, it would be nice to think it was, and it would be nice to think that you were holding a prayer book that had a tenuous connection with the Beatles. One of the things that Paul McCartney actually said was that he had noticed a lot of what he described as elderly ladies going to church on their own, and he always thought and felt that maybe they had lost their husbands during the war, and that's why they hadn't remarried, and they were lonely people because they had lost their husband and they had not remarried, and that's why they were lonely.
It's likely that it's only Eleanor Rigby's name that Lennon and McCartney took, subconsciously or otherwise, from the gravestone in St Peter's Churchyard. The real Eleanor shared an untold story with many other Liverpool women of her generation. Eleanor lived most of her life in a busy multi-generational household on Vale Road in Woolton, surrounded by extended family living in the streets around. According to census records, Eleanor was born in 1895. She would have been 19 when the First World War broke out. In the early 1960s, when Lennon and McCartney wrote the song, the character of the maiden aunt left on the shelf was common. Many women who were young in the 1920s remained unmarried due to the drop in male population as a result of World War I, losing fiancés and sweethearts. This may be reflected in the pathos and wistfulness of the song. Although it seems life would have been tough during that time for Eleanor, it's very possible that the real life of Eleanor Rigby was not like that at all.
Woolton, quite a wealthy village. It's not within Liverpool, it's just on the boundaries, not incorporated into Liverpool, not formerly a suburb of Liverpool until 1913. And you've got, of course, the main employment here is the quarries. And because of the quarries, you've got wealth, you've got the big houses. You notice a lot of the stone here is the same stone exactly that's used for the Anglican Cathedral in the city, which is being built a little bit later on. But because of the quarrying, obviously you've got great wealth out here, established families, big houses, but you've also inevitably got a class divide. So you've got the sort of affluent side of Woolton, but also where Eleanor would have grown up, which is the less affluent side, the working class side of Woolton, where a lot of the quarry workers would have lived themselves.
So Eleanor's life within the community,
Right.
how would this have made a difference with her home life and her upbringing?
I suppose Eleanor, growing up, her mother is widowed, living with the grandfather, her mother's new family, quite a lot of mouths to feed. It's going to be a working class family. They're living in essentially the working class part of Woolton, the less affluent part of town. Things are going to be a bit cramped. It's going to be hard in terms of survival. We're talking about a period here, pre-welfare state. It's tough. It's tough for a lot of people, especially working class here in Woolton.
So going kind of further along, so after kind of the war period and stuff, moving up to the 1960s, do you think that would have still been the case?
Eleanor comes from the Rigby family. Obviously, as you see in a lot of the gravestones here, Rigby is an established family. There's a lot of Rigbys around here. Obviously, in Eleanor's personal circumstances, a working class family, she has a tough job. She probably has got a tough life. But, she's grown up here in Woolton, which still has the village feel, okay, although it's formerly part of Liverpool. She has the church here. We know she's quite active in her faith. She does attend church services here in the Anglican Church. So she has her faith. She has the community. She, of course, has friends growing up in the area. At the same time, to come back to her loneliness, she belongs to that generation of women where not only are they suffering from the lost generation of men, okay, the men that have been wiped out, but also think about that in terms of the social pressures on women at the time.
Walk through the streets of Liverpool and you are surrounded by reminders of the city's past, of the people who filled these streets in the generations before us. Famous names from history to dock workers and shop girls, legends of popular culture to everyday heroes. Liverpool Lives takes a look into their stories.
More than 100 men from Woolton were lost in World War I. Perhaps Eleanor was waiting for someone to come back from the Great War.
It's likely that many families from the streets surrounding Eleanor's home will have lost sons, husbands, brothers and sweethearts. One of the young men lost from the parish of St Peter's and St Paul's was Reginald Rigby. Born in Woolton the same year as Eleanor, at the outbreak of war in August 1914 he was only aged 18. Reginald joined the Navy.
He was killed 6 months later when his ship, HMS Bulwark, was sunk by an onboard munitions explosion.
Well, Eleanor is growing up in a street like this. We know from her occupation that she was a scullery maid. And if you look at Mrs. Beeton's Book of the Household, which is, the famous, it's the Bible really in the sort of Victorian and Edwardian period for household management. And we know that the scullery maid is described in Mrs. Beeton as really the most menial of jobs. I think she would have been the eldest. I mean, her mother was widowed. She's living with the grandfather. I believe her mother's children from a new relationship. So there would have been pressure on her to go out and earn a wage. You do get this phenomenon, especially after the war, of the sort of, the lonely maid, because you've got the death of that generation of young men, a lot of men being wiped out, even, in quite an affluent suburb like this, like Woolton. I mean, Woolton is only incorporated into the city in 1913, so it's really still a village feel. But even in a village like that, you've got the death of a lot of young men. Were there opportunities for her to go and socialise and meet young men? A lot of those men would have been gone, quite simply killed on the Western Front and elsewhere. So really, I think in terms of her occupation and in terms of the unlucky fact that she grows up in that generation and going into the post-war period, it could have been quite a lonely life. For a lot of women in the post-war period, the war is good for female employment because it creates jobs in factories and elsewhere.
Yeah, there were a lot of women who lost their jobs after the war. They would have either have been put out of work because they worked in shell factories and they were no longer needed. We know that there is evidence of shell factories letting hundreds of women go with just a couple of weeks' notice because the shells are no longer needed at the front. But also the returning heroes who 4 years previously had been told by employers who thought the war would be over by Christmas that they'd hold their jobs, they're coming back after 4 years, and for 4 years women have been working and doing their roles and carrying out tasks that they wouldn't have ever been expected to carry out. then suddenly those women are being told, headlines in the newspaper, women must go, give your jobs up for heroes, and suddenly they're being expected to give up the money that they're earning and their independence that they've earned so that they can give the jobs back to the men who've come back from the front.
It's quite strange really to think that people from the village that I've lived in all my life went off to fight. Whole generations of people, whole streets went, and what's now a nursing home was a convalescent home for the war, and was a nurse's home where the nurses stayed. To think that the people that were fighting at the front came home to such a sanctuary of a lovely scenery, and people who actually cared for them. It means a lot to live so close to somewhere that done such a good job during the war as well. I can just imagine what war was like for such a small village, to have so many men taken away from them, whole men from whole streets, whole families. It must have been so devastating to me that we remember people who are from the church. And I've actually found through the Commonwealth War Graves Commission 2 of the names, Robert and Foster Smith, where they're buried, where they lived, and to think that they only lived down the road and they gave their life for their country. I mean, there's so many different areas that women were involved in. Food, so the Land Army, nursing. It was just they'd done so many different jobs that people don't actually realise, because obviously they had to take up men's roles. So there was quite a lot of like secretarial work, clerk work that they'd never been allowed to do, especially like munitions factories. And they liked, many women liked the independence, and some say it did actually change the role of women forever.
A lot of the men died, and especially in a community like this, it would kind of hit the women in the community very hard, because suddenly all the breadwinners would have gone. Kind of from that perspective, how did the women kind of cope?
Well, I think Eleanor would have grown up in a family where her father's not around, so she's probably more used to it than a lot of families. But still, it's a good point, because that generation of men that have been lost, of young men, weighs very heavy on women of Eleanor's generation. In a place like this, you're surrounded essentially by the dead. The spirit of the dead in people's consciousness weighed very heavily. It's no coincidence that after the First World War, you start to get, boom in things like spiritualism and seances, that thing. So the spirit of the dead sort of lives on, and it's almost this sort of ghostly idea which is still there. And Eleanor, I think, really, she would have felt those pressures anyway. Her father's not there, living with the grandfather, her mother with the family, new children to feed. I think for Eleanor, a lot of those pressures have always been there. So I think for her, a hard life probably continued despite the war and despite the post-war period.
After the end of World War I, Eleanor remained unmarried until 1930, when, at the age of 35, she married Thomas Woods. At the time, Thomas was 53 and had been married with 2 other grown children. He also came to live in Vale Road with Eleanor's mother, aunt and 2 younger half-sisters. Eleanor died at the age of 44 of a brain hemorrhage in October 1939. By the 1960s, when the song was written, only her half-sisters, Hannah and Edith, were still living, and as far as is known, still in Vale Road. Although it's unlikely that the prayer book Tony Williams found in Texas was once owned by the same Eleanor Rigby of Walton, and possibly the song, she was indeed a real person. However, in reality there could be 3 Eleanor Rigbys which are synonymous to the myth. The fictional Eleanor Rigby of the song, the tragic lonely spinster. The fantasy Eleanor, based on McCartney's liking for Eleanor Bron. And the real Eleanor, who is buried in St Peter's churchyard. Someone who was surrounded by family and friends, and lived a real, full-blooded Liverpool life.